Hello, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby and today we're going to be doing my March wrap up. It's already the end of March, like what the heck? And in the month of March, I read a total of 11 books. I did have a few different DNFs this month though, so I feel like I ended up reading a lot more than I actually did. But this month, I tried to read The Chill by Scott Carson. It didn't happen. I got about 88 pages into this one before I gave up. And then I also tried to read The Hollow Places, and I'm pretty sure I got about 100 pages into this one before I called it quits. And then I also attempted to listen to the Una Out of Order audiobook, and this was my second time trying to get into this book, and I still only got 40% in before I decided that I don't really care, and I just couldn't get into it. So out of the 11 books that I did read this month, I read 2 horror novels, 1 romance, 1 historical fiction, 2 sci-fi thrillers, and 5 regular thrillers. I was just in a thriller mood this month. I don't know how to explain it. I can't kick this thriller mood that I'm in right now. I think it's because I've been reading some really good thrillers lately, which we'll get to. And then as far as ratings go, I had really high ratings this month for the most part. I had 2 5-star books, 7 4-star books, and only 2 2-star books. So there was like nothing in the middle. I had no 3 stars. It was either great or it was terrible, and there was no in between. I mean, to be fair, out of those 4 stars, I did have a few of them that were more closer to like 3.5s, but still a really great reading month overall. Whoa! I also did want to say too that I had 6 out of the 11 books that I read this month were audiobooks, and some of those I did listen to them while physically reading the book as well, but audiobooks really got me through this month. I also do have a code for Libro in my description if you do want to check out audiobooks. You can get 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 when you use my code. Anyways, let's get to the books. So the first book I read this month was The Deep by Nick Cutter. This was actually the first book I read for this video I did at the very beginning of the month called like Drowning in Horror Books, and it was a reading vlog that I did dedicated to reading horror books that take place underwater. I will link it down below and up above if you missed it because it was a really fun time, but this was the first book that I read for that video, and this book was very interesting. This is the same author as The Troop, if you didn't know, which is one of my favorite horror books of all time, so I went into this one with some pretty high expectations. In this book, there's this plague called the Gets that's like taking over the whole world, and it's basically a plague where you like start to forget things, and at first it's like the little things, and then it starts to turn into the bigger things, and then before you know it, your body no longer remembers how to function. It's very scary, and we're following these 2 brothers. One of them is like this really nerdy scientist who knows a lot of things, and he is 8 miles beneath the surface of the ocean because they think they've discovered something down there that might help them solve this plague. And so our main character goes down to join him down there, and most of this book does take place 8 miles beneath the surface of the ocean, and it's very scary. This book is just very claustrophobic and unsettling and disturbing. If you're used to Nick Cutter's writing, then you're probably familiar with his very graphic writing style and how it's just very disturbing. It gets under your skin, you know? I will say this book did get a little bit repetitive towards the end. I thought it was a little bit long because it's nearly 400 pages, and I thought the ending was just a little bit underwhelming. Like, I just wasn't a huge fan of the ending, so I did end up giving this one around 3.5, but I did end up rounding it up to 4 because I still had so much fun reading this book. And then the second book that I ended up reading for that video is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, and this is the one that I specifically read because so many of you had recommended it to me. I had never even heard of this book, but this book is another underwater horror book that deals with killer mermaids. I've always imagined mermaids, you know, to be like these like fun creatures. Like, I've only ever seen mermaids in like The Little Mermaid and like Aquamarine. So this was like a totally different experience to see these killer mermaids in this book. They were honestly more like sharks, and they were just so scary to read about, and I just had so much fun reading this book. I love the different representation in this book because not only do they have a deaf character in this book, but they also have a female-female relationship pretty much at the center of this novel. So there was so much to love about it, and this is one that I listened to to entirely as an audiobook, and it was such an experience only listening to this on audio, because since I wasn't reading it physically with it, I had no idea what to expect with like what was coming next, and it was very suspenseful. I will say the ending of this book is also very abrupt. Like, I wasn't a huge fan of the way this book ended, and I did have a few different like little nitpicky issues with it, so I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars, but I still had so much fun with this book, and I still highly recommend it. Third book that I read this month was The Maids by Alex Michaelides, and this one is an ARC copy. This one doesn't go on sale until June this year, so it's still a little bit of a ways away, but this book, oh my god, this was the first book that I read for a video of like reading 3 highly anticipated thriller novels, so this was included in another reading vlog this month. I'll link it down below and up above. This book was so entertaining, and if you didn't know, Alex Michaelides is the author of The Silent Patient, you know, which is one of my absolute favorite thrillers of all time, so I was very highly anticipating this one. And this one is a totally different feel from The Silent Patient, because we're dealing with this professor dude who's getting accused of murdering one of his students. And it's so fascinating because in this book we're following this girl named Mariana, and she is a group therapist who is the aunt of one of the students who's currently on the campus. So her niece, Zoe, is actually really good friends with the girl who just got murdered. So naturally, her aunt, Mariana, who's our main character, comes and stays with her on the campus, and because she's like a group therapist, she just has really good like insight into being able to read people. This one is so like Greek tragedy murder vibes. It has the like vibe of like the college students who are very narcissistic and think they know everything and they think they're better than everyone. It's very much the Secret History vibes and like dark academia vibes, and I loved that about this book so much. And I flew through this book so quickly. Like, I think I could have finished this all in one sitting if I had had the time to do so, because it was just so easy to fly through and it was so good, and I just had to know where it was going. So I ended up giving this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's definitely one of my favorite thrillers that I've read so far this year. Also read Act Your Age, Eve Brown. I ended up listening to this one as an audiobook on Libro because they included it as one of their like ALC advanced listening copies for the month of March. This is the 3rd book in the Brown sisters trilogy. Both of the previous books, Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and Take a Hint, Dani Brown, were some of my favorite romances of last year, so I was very excited to get to this one. And this one, I really loved it, but I will say I don't think I enjoyed this one quite as much as the previous 2 books, and I don't know if that's because I listened to this book as an audiobook as opposed to reading it physically, because the other 2 I had read them physically, and usually with romances I do prefer to read romances physically. I can't explain why, but I just don't love the experience of listening to a romance on audio, at least for the first time listening to it. The audiobook was really fun, like, don't get me wrong, but there's something like so uncomfortable for me like listening to sex scenes in an audiobook. I don't even know how to accurately explain this to you, but it makes me a little bit uncomfy, and I'd just rather read it physically with my eyes than listen to it than have it like told to me. This book was a little bit smut heavy for my personal taste. I can't remember if the previous 2 books were like this, but because I was listening to this one on audio, I was like, wow, this is really smut heavy. I still had a really fun time with these characters. I adored Eve's character. I always love reading about the Brown sisters just because they have such a funny personality to read about, and I just really connect with their characters. And I did like the love interest Jacob in this book. I thought he was really soft and really wholesome and really cute, and they did have some really great banter. Like, I really loved the first 50% of this book. I thought the first 50% was like fucking amazing, 5-star worthy, but then it was like the last 50% it got a little bit too, I don't know, repetitive with like the sex scenes for me. I just kind of got bored, and so I ended up giving this one 4 stars. It's just I still really loved it. It's just not my favorite out of the 3. I think Take a Hint, Dani Brown will always be my favorite. The next book that I read this month was Too Good to Be True by Carola Lovering. This is the 2nd book that I read for that video of like reading some new hyped thrillers vlog that I did, and this book, I'm surprised by how much that I enjoyed this. And in this book, all it says on the back is 1 love story, 2 marriages, 3 versions of the truth. Something that I like about this book is that we're following 3 different points of views in different points in time. So the main girl that we're following, Sky, she's like our main character, and she's currently getting engaged to this guy named Burke. And then I like it because we also get Burke's point of view in diary entries, which I think is a unique thing to get. And then in a 3rd point of view, we're following this girl Heather in the 1980s. I don't know, I really enjoyed this book. I saw some people saying if you liked the book The Wife Between Us, then they think you would also like this book, but I really didn't like The Wife Between Us, so I would almost say if you didn't like The Wife Between Us, maybe check out this book, because I feel like this book did a better job with a similar type of twist. I ended up giving it like a 3.5 just because the ending didn't go exactly where I wanted it to go. I wanted it to go a little bit darker at the ending. It was a little bit too like romance at the end for me, but I still had a fun time. I enjoyed this one a lot more than I thought I would. Another audiobook that I've listened to this month was The Echo Wife. Audiobook was provided to me by Macmillan Audio, so thank you so much to them. And this is one that I was pleasantly surprised by because this one is a sci-fi thriller, and I've heard some mixed reviews about this one from my friends, but I think the reason why I ended up enjoying this one a little bit more is because I went into this one not even knowing what it was about. Like, I had zero ideas. So basically in this book, we're following this woman named Evelyn, who is like an award-winning scientist. And what ends up happening is that her husband is able to create this clone from her research. And this clone is like this perfect version of Evelyn. Like, it's really strange. She's like a robot, but she's still like a human. And Evelyn finds out that this clone is fucking her husband, and like her husband's cheating on her with this fucking clone. Then she finds out that her husband is dead, and she has to figure out why and like what happened there. And I just found this book to be so fascinating because since I had no idea what this was about going into it, I just did not expect any of those things. And I can see some people being disappointed in this book because this book probably doesn't go exactly where you think it's going to go, and it never really like steps it up with the action. It's just a really like thought-provoking, interesting, more sci-fi I would say than thriller. But at the same time, I just found this book to be so fascinating. Like, I love any kind of books that discuss the idea of clones. I don't know, I found it to be very, very fascinating. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 out of 5 stars because, again, this book I think is being a little bit mismarketed because it's not that thrilling. Like, there's like very few moments in this book that feel like a thriller to me. It definitely feels more like a mystery and sci-fi kind of vibe. I didn't mind it. I enjoyed it. Unlike the next book that I read, which was The Minders by John Mars. I actually included this book in that reading vlog that I did, and then this was also the Book Troop book club pick for this month. If you didn't know, I have a thriller book club. It's called the Book Troop, and I recently just did the live show with Katie for this book, so again, I'll have to link that down below if you missed it. Ended up being pretty disappointing, unfortunately. I think I am settling on the fact that I'm gonna give it 2 stars now. This book, it's like hard to even explain what this is about, but unfortunately this book does include spoilers for the one and the passengers. Even though it's not included as like part of a series, I would say that you should probably read those 2 books first because the beginning of this will spoil you for that. The government in the UK keeps getting hacked, and so they need to figure out a way to make their system like unhackable. And so their idea is that they're going to put all of the information that could potentially be hacked into the brain of 5 random people, which are going to be called the Minders, and they are going to have all of the information in the world, but they're going to be like 5 random people, and they're not going to have any security so that they don't know, like the hackers don't know who in the UK has these things in their minds. And you know, it's an interesting-ish concept for sure. I wasn't completely bored with this book, but most of it was so repetitive, so boring. We're following like 5 different points of view in this book, and honestly, so many of them read so similarly that I was having a really hard time between distincting the different voices in this book. And overall, I just got really bored with the storyline. Like, I just found it to be really boring after part 2. I wasn't invested in any of the characters in this book. I just didn't really care. And not only that, but I find the ending of this book to be also pretty underwhelming. Like, I wasn't very satisfied with where it ended up going, and there were just so many plot holes in this book, most of this which we did cover in the live show, so you can check that out. The next book I read, however, was actually pretty decent, which is Is Maud Dixon. This is a mystery thriller that just came out a little while ago, and this book actually surprised me a lot. Like, I ended up having a lot of fun with this book. I will say though that I don't recommend reading the description of this book before you read it, because I do think the description of the book spoils you major. But just to give you a general idea of what this book is about, we're following this woman named Florence who works in the book publishing industry in that world, and she gets let go from her job pretty early on in this book, and then she gets the opportunity to maybe work for this author who's called Maud Dixon, who writes under this pen name named Maud Dixon. Like, nobody knows like who they are. They're like very mysterious, but they wrote one of the best-selling novels, and they're like a rich and famous author now, but nobody knows who they are. And so she gets the opportunity to be able to work for them, and then things kind of take off from there. I don't think you need to know more than that going into this book. Like, that is all you need to know. If that sounds interesting to you at all, then I would highly recommend this. But I do feel like the description of this book, it literally spoils you for things that happen like much later on in the book. But this book was so great. I just loved the vibe of it. I loved the writing style. I just connected to it immediately, and I started and finished this book within 24 hours because I couldn't put it down. I had to know what was going on. I did have a few little nitpicky things about this book that I got into more on my Goodreads review with like some spoilers that I talked about. But besides that, I had a really great time reading this. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. Next book that I read this month was Later by Stephen King. I actually did an entire reading vlog dedicated to this book this month, so again, I'll link that down below if you missed it. But this book was good. It just wasn't as great as I was hoping it would be. In this book, we're following this young kid named Jamie who has these supernatural abilities because he's able to see people after they've died. This book, the thing I didn't like about it though is that it turns into kind of more of a crime novel, which, you know, I should have, you know, guessed that because this is like a hard case crime novel. Whoa, what are words? And so I really enjoyed the supernatural aspects of this book, but unfortunately I didn't end up loving some of the crime parts of this book, so I ended up giving this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I didn't dislike it, but I also wasn't as in love with it as I hoped I would be. I mean, I was still able to fly through this book all in one day because it is very short. It's only about like 260 pages, but I also wasn't a huge fan of the final plot twist. I was like, what the fuck? That is so unnecessary. The next book I read was Firefly Lane by Kristen Hanna. I ended up buying this book from Libro and listening to it as an audiobook because I just thought the audiobook would be a really great time. I've got to say, I only read this book because I watched the show Firefly Lane on Netflix last month, and I really, really loved the show. Like, I immediately fell in love with the characters. I thought Kate was one of the most like relatable characters I've ever seen on screen, and I really adored Tully's character in the show. My god, this book, like, what a hot mess. I was not a huge fan of this book because I feel like these characters came off so differently in this book than they did in the show. I don't know if it's because I saw the show first, but in the book I just didn't like some of the way that this plot worked out. I wasn't a huge fan of Tully in the book. I actually thought she was so obnoxious and so narcissistic, and like some of the things she does in this book are just unforgivable. Like, it's hard to read about because I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with you? I appreciated the changes they made in the show. It made more sense for those things to happen the way they did in the show. I just wasn't a huge fan of this book, which I was surprised by. Like, I just went into this expecting to love it, not only because it's Kristen Hanna and because I already loved the show. So I didn't really expect to not like this book as much. I just found these characters to be so obnoxious in this book. So yeah, I'm sad to say I wasn't really a huge fan of this one. I ended up giving it 2 stars, and I don't plan to continue on in this book series. All right, and then the last and final book that I read in the month of March was one of my favorite books that I've read this year so far, and that is Finlay Donovan Is Killing It by Elle Cosimano. And this book, I know I keep saying every book is fun, like that's my new saying, I guess, but this book was the most fun. I actually ended up listening to this one on audio because I got the audio sent to me from Macmillan again, so huge thank you to Macmillan. After I got 50% of the way through this audio, I literally went out to Barnes & Noble the next day and purchased this book because I knew I was gonna love it. I knew it was gonna be a 5-star, and I had to own the physical copy. So then for the last 50%, I was able to follow along in the book and finish the audio that way. I also buddy read this book with my friend Brittany. This book was just so amazing. This book, if you didn't know anything about it, we're following this author named Finlay Donovan, and she writes these like crime, romance, thriller kind of novels. And she goes out to a Panera Bread one day with her agent, and they're talking about her next novel, and a woman overhears her in the Panera, and she actually thinks that she's like a contract killer because of the terms that she's using. Like, she's talking about her thriller novel that involves murder, but she doesn't realize that she's talking about her book. She thinks she's like a straight up killer. And so this lady in the Panera offers her $50,000 to kill her husband. And then Finlay is like trying to figure out what to do because she's a struggling single mother and she really needs the money. She really does need the money. And so this book just takes off from there, and it's so entertaining. This book reminded me a lot of the TV show Dead to Me. Like, it has very similar vibes in the sense that you're dealing with like some serious subjects like murder and crime, but it's also really, really funny and lighthearted, and it has likable characters. I just absolutely adored all of the characters in this book. I love Finlay, I love Vero, I love Julian. Like, all of them were just so sweet, and they were the most wholesome characters to read about in a thriller like this. And I'm so glad this is already getting adapted for TV, and it's the first book in a series, because the way that this book ends, like, holy fuck, the ending, I was shook. I was like, there is no way this is a standalone, because that ending, what the heck. This one does end off on a little bit of a cliffhanger because it's part of a series, but oh my god, I loved it so much. I did have a few like tiny little nitpicks with the plot, but honestly, like, I just had to give this book 5 stars because of the joy it brought to me. Like, it was so much fun. And this is another book that I read it all within 24 hours. Like, I started it one night, got 50% of the way through, and then the next afternoon I listened to the other 50% because I just could not put this down. It was just so cute, and every single chapter ends with like a little something that makes you want to immediately start the next chapter. So it was just great. It's honestly one of my favorite books that I read this year. I just had such a fun time reading this book. So yeah, there you go. Finlay Donovan. Who knew? I'm shook. I loved it. Now, those are all the books that I read in the month of March. I had a really, really great reading month. Like, there was only a few things that I did not enjoy this month, and that makes me happy. I don't know which book is my favorite for this month. Probably Finlay Donovan is killing it, is probably my favorite, but I also really, really love the Maidens. And now because of these 2 books, I'm just like on a thriller kick. Like, I cannot stop reading thrillers. I'm already currently halfway through my first thriller for April. Woo! And it's looking to be a 5-star. Ugh, things are going great. Those are all the books that I read in the month of March. Please let me know if you've also read any of these books. What are your thoughts? And if you plan to read any of these books now, also let me know that. And let me know, what was the best book that you read in the month of March? What was the worst book that you read in the month of March? And thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with a new video. Bye!